Oh, wow. So I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes, just in case people are still joining before we start.
Yeah, of course.
Shall we begin? Shall we begin?
Yeah, let's do it.
Perfect. So,
All right.
Just a quick note for attendees. If you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you look at the bottom of the page, Q&A box should be there, and feel free to post questions as you go. And I will put the questions to Matt for the duration of the event. I'll just introduce Matt. So Matt is the PoliticsHome acting editor and has been a news editor since 2018. He first joined PoliticsHome as a junior reporter in 2014, and from 2015 to 2017 served as the deputy and online editor of Civil Service World, covering the fallout of the Brexit referendum in Whitehall. He's also written for The New Statesman, The House Magazine, HuffPost UK, The Eye, and studied political journalism at City University in London. So I will allow you to take over.
All right, thank you. First of all, thanks for having me on, and thank you to anyone tuned in for giving up their Monday evening to listen to a journalist talk about journalism, which is something that everyone in journalism loves doing. We love talking about ourselves, so it's a real treat. And I appreciate pubs are also open at this point, so you had other options. You're not just all stuck in your homes anymore. So thank you very much. When I said I was giving this talk, some colleagues in the industry sort of rolled their eyes. Why would you tell anybody to get into political journalism in 2020? Why would you tell anybody to get into political writing? I mean, it's no secret at the minute that the news industry is in trouble. The pandemic has hit the industry even harder, but it's been in structural problems for decades. Newsrooms are shrinking. People are being asked to cover a lot more with a lot less, and you are a lot more kind of in the public eye than you would be previously because of social media. Sometimes that's fantastic. People will correct your stories because they're right. Other times they'll just call you stuff on the internet, which, you know, you cry about for like 3 or 4 hours and then you move on. But most days, political journalism is still a million times better than a real job. I get to spend most of my day reading and writing about politics, and at a time like this, it's an incredible privilege and a responsibility. I get to learn about the way the country is run. I get to get my head around big decisions and how they affect people's lives. I get to talk to people who are making a difference. Sometimes get to talk to people who are stopping them from making a difference. I get to spot policy changes, highlight problems, grill ministers on what they are and aren't doing, how that compares to what they said they would do. And I get to, when I'm not sat in my living room like we kind of all are sat in our living rooms at the minute, I get to work in the House of Commons, which is an incredible privilege. It's, you know, I'm sure many of you guys will have been there, but it's a mad Hogwarts castle of mice and exposed wiring and people who look about 12 years old who have a very high opinion of themselves and call themselves chief of staff. So it's an interesting place with interesting characters and all sorts going on, and there isn't really a day where I don't think I'm just insanely lucky to be doing this. And another thing, I'm professionally required to be an annoying person. I get to ask impertinent questions, and that's part of the job. And there aren't many lines of work where you can say that. So I would never ever tell anybody not to get into this line of work, not to give it a go. When I sort of thought about doing this talk, I didn't want to give you guys a bunch of sort of false optimism about how easy journalism is as an industry, but it is worthwhile. And I think it's something that, anybody wanting to go into it, I'd say just go for it. Just please give it a go, because the highs are amazing, and it's worthwhile. So my first kind of caveat in doling out advice to you guys is that I come at this as a political reporter, so a kind of news guy, rather than a sort of columnist or a polemicist or an author. But they are really, really valuable parts of political journalism. They take a lot of skill, and they're just not my personal strong point. But I think even the best kind of arguer, the best debater, the best kind of opinion monger, person who wants to really affect change, still has their writing enhanced by reporting skills and the basics of doing good journalism. I think these things apply kind of across disciplines. So I wanted to start by talking about some of the things that I look for in a political reporter, some of the things I think make a good political reporter. Other editors will have a different take on this, but this is kind of where I've gotten to after a decade of doing this now, which makes me feel very old. So what do I look for? So the first one, it sounds cheesy, but enthusiasm is a really big thing, and it will get you through really hard days. My old editor, Paul, said to me on one of my first days that if we don't enjoy doing this, we shouldn't do it. And I still think about that quite a bit. I've talked about the job being knackering and painted a kind of grim picture of the industry, but fundamentally what will drive you in doing is if you care about politics, you care about the decisions that are made in Westminster and Whitehall and beyond, and you feel a duty to help explain and understand and question those. And I'm not, trying to flatter you guys, but I think a young Fabian's audience probably is already partway there on that front. You guys care enough to tune into something like this on a Monday night, but it will take you some way. And I think one of the things I would say you should do when you start out, when you're considering starting out in political journalism, is kind of decide why you're personally doing it. There are all sorts of motives for getting into political journalism, and I kind of make no judgment on different people's motives, but sometimes it's about kind of proximity to power. Sometimes it's about wanting to be in the room where the big decisions are being made. I mean, certainly last year's Brexit drama, being sat in the Commons and some of those knife-edge votes, you felt a sense of history. Sometimes you want to get just stuck into the detail and nerd out about things, and that is another valid reason to get into political journalism. Sometimes you just want to rail against something and sort of change the world, and that also is a valid reason to get into it. But thinking about why you're doing it, I think, can kind of help you decide what set of skills you need to arm yourself with. And I think start by picking people you admire. Start by looking at political journalists, or even journalists more broadly, who you think do a great job. And one thing that I found helpful when I was starting out is to just read a lot of good political journalism. I mean, obviously that's everything I do, but there are lots of great reporters out there. And if you look at their stories and try to work backwards, try to think, well, where did they get this information from? Where did they get these skills from? What are the pieces that made this story come about? And by doing that process, the more you do it, the more you'll think, well, what do I need? What am I missing from my current skill set to do this? So another thing that I really admire, and this is kind of interrelated, is reporters with an eye for detail. So, talked about journalism being tough, and one of the tendencies is that companies want stuff that's really cheap and cheerful. You have to resist the tendency to be lazy and kind of give in. And you can probably carve a sort of entry-level job in journalism by just rewriting people's tweets, but the stuff that your readers will care about, the stuff that will keep them coming back, the stuff that other journalists will notice, the stuff that people in Westminster will notice, will be the stuff that you've put the effort into. And having an eye for detail will really mark you out in that kind of reporting. So one thing I would start to do is, one thing I would say is think about the fact that we as journalists, much of what we report on, the material is out there. So it's stuff people say in Parliament, but it's also all the documents published on gov.uk. It's the transparency information on departmental websites. It's WMSs, statutory instruments, stuff from the Office for National Statistics. You'd be surprised how many journalists don't look at this stuff, don't read the documents, don't get into the detail, and actually often just combing through stuff that the government is putting into the public domain and being one of the people in a kind of age of information overload that is actively looking at this stuff and scrutinising it can be a great way into a story. You never know what you're going to stumble across. And I think all too often we sort of wait for Boris Johnson said or Keir Starmer said as the way into the story. But if you can start right now being proactive, looking at the same kind of things we look at with a kind of critical and skeptical eye. So one of the things that can be quite intimidating when you start journalism is you might not have the contacts, but doing that detail, doing that digging, being interested in the same things people are into can actually get you part way there. So I would just plead with you to look at some stories you admire and think about where the information's come from and get your head around those information sources. I would say if you want to carve out a niche for yourself, pick an area of public policy that is underreported. So it could be something that makes you really angry, something that you think is really poorly understood, or something that you just kind of want to understand because you're interested in it. I mean, in a sense, if you're a day job staff journalist, you've got deadlines to meet, but you guys can begin doing this now about whatever interests you, and just start mapping out where the information comes from, who talks about it, and start to piece those things together yourself. My friend Adam Payne from Business Insider, he did a really good story last week that was Liz Truss, a leaked letter from Liz Truss, the International Trade Secretary, to Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and Michael Gove, the Cabinet Office Minister, warning about a whole series of concerns about the UK's post-Brexit border plans. Now, that leaked letter didn't just kind of fall from the sky to Adam. The reason that came to him is because he's spent 3 or 4 years now carving out a niche in political journalism. And he's done that by being the kind of details guy. And I asked him to sort of give me a bit of advice on, just because I have no original thoughts of my own, give me a bit of advice on what to say here. And he sort of said, look, find a niche. Like most things, it's much easier said than done, but finding a niche can help you quickly develop an audience and it can get your name out there. So he said, immediately after the Brexit vote, I decided to focus on technical aspects of Brexit rather than just its political ramifications. E.g., what would it mean for borders? What would it mean for the price of food, for Northern Ireland, the role of the European Parliament? And because at the time, not many other journalists in the UK were writing about these things, I was getting a bit of a reputation for my coverage pretty quickly. Adam says, carving out a niche, trying to make it your own, will also prompt interesting and important people and potential information and sources to come forward. So choose a niche, stick to it, give yourself a chance to become an expert in an area. That can only ever be a good thing. I would heartily endorse that advice from Adam, and I think journalism needs more people like that, more people who are keen to think a little bit ahead and anticipate where the story might go and what the ramifications might be beyond just the kind of day-to-day stuff. So this kind of brings me on to my next thing I look for in a good political journalist, which is the ability to move a story on. And I'll sort of unpack what I mean by that. You might get a press release from Number 10. Boris Johnson is announcing X billion of investment in widgets in Wigan. Like, it's a story. The fact that the Prime Minister is saying something and announcing something is a story. There'll be opposition reaction to it. You can piece those two things together and you've got a credible political story. But journalists who move the story on will look at that and think, how can I pick up the phone and add something to this? So if it's, for example, an NHS funding announcement, well, what do the unions think? What do employers groups think? What do the people on the ground who have to turn this pot of money from Whitehall into practical care for people think about something? And you can almost approach it from the bottom up. And that's something that is actually easier to do when you're starting out in journalism and you don't always have the big, the access to Number 10 or access to the Department of Health. I would say when you're filing a story, when you're drafting a story, try and think like a reader. So think about what questions would you still like to be answered if you were reading your own copy back. You might end up with 2 or 3 follow-up story ideas just from reading back your own copy. Every time you do a story, you should try and think about the next few steps in that story. And you can start doing that right now, like I say, by reading journalists that you admire, thinking, this is great, but what do I still want to know after reading this story? What are the bits that haven't been explained or that haven't been, that I feel were missing from it? What were the perspectives they didn't touch on? And the more you do that, the more you make those notes, the more, in my view, story ideas you'll have. And that is always the starting point, is the series of questions that get you to do journalism. Another thing I think is undervalued in journalism, but I think is really important, is an ability to be wrong, which sounds a bit counterintuitive. Like you don't want to be a wrong journalist, but you need to be prepared to be wrong, and you need to be prepared to turn a hunch into a story. So you might think something about a policy or a politician, and that might be your kind of starting place. But you should always be willing to be wrong and to pick up the phone and to test that and stress test it, really. Send those emails, have those annoying conversations, be annoying. If at the end of all that, your initial theory is still right, that's great, you've got a story. If it's wrong, it doesn't mean give up, but it means you might have to seriously rethink the story you're telling. Something new might emerge from that process that's even better than the original idea you had. But being prepared to be, you need to be persistent, but not stubborn, to the point where if what you're trying to do is kind of factually inaccurate, you need to be able to kind of give up and go, look, I need to rethink this. And I think kind of too often, and I've been guilty of this before, that you can be on deadline and try to make the facts fit a story. Nobody is served by that. And I think it's particularly important at a time where people have low trust in journalism. We're saturated by information from all kinds of sources, all kinds of journalists, good and bad, all kinds of people badging themselves as journalists who aren't. So the more you do that rigorous process before publication, the more you do it while you're thinking through your ideas, the more kind of bulletproof it will be, and the better you'll feel as a reporter. So always pick up the phone. The old journalism adage is still true, and I'm trying not to be the aging journalism lecturer talking about the glory days of 3-bottle lunches or anything like that. But there is an old adage that still works, which is, if your mum says she loves you, check it out. And you should just have that. You should just think of that all the time. No matter how much you believe in something, you need to be able to show you're working, at least to your editors. And you'll feel, it's a faff, but you'll feel better for it afterwards. Another tip I would give you guys is not to turn your nose up at gossip. So if you haven't already, Marie Leconte has a really good book on why political gossip matters. Everybody claims that they're above it. Everybody also then does it. And that can be people in the cabinet. It could be people just, people in student politics, or just you and your friends. Like, the world runs on gossip and conversation and interaction with people. Obviously a little bit harder at the moment when we're all sat behind a screen, but you kind of can't understand politics without accepting that there is that personal drama behind it as well, the power play. And you might begin thinking that stuff is quite frivolous, and I perhaps did when I first started out, because I thought, no, I'm a serious policy reporter, but the stuff interacts and you can't separate the two. So I would say, don't ever turn up at the chance to meet people that you might profoundly disagree with. If you get an invite to something, just go. If it's a room full of people 99% sure you are going to hate, just go in there with an open mind, pretend you're working on a documentary in your own head, and you're just going to meet some weird characters and broaden your own horizons, and you're going to talk to them about what they do, why they think it matters, who they love, who they hate. And that can be from the most kind of, downtrodden local councillor to a parliamentary researcher to a minister of state, someone from a think tank. People just love talking about what they do. And it ties into the stuff about detail. Do a bit of homework, and that goes a long way in these conversations. Be interested, and you kind of never know when something that seems really niche at the time, like Adam's point about, what's going to happen to, food exports, everyone's excited about the political drama. You might meet the one person in the room who is an absolute expert on this niche thing that 6 months down the line becomes huge. So I would say there is never a wasted contact. There's never a wasted conversation. There'll be frustrating conversations. There'll be people you really don't like. I'm sure loads of people have met me and not liked me. But it's just a fact of life in Westminster that you probably can't get by without doing a little bit of gossip. If you're a bit shy, like I am, and you don't love the prospect of working the room with a glass of really terrible, mouth-burning, warm wine, that's fine too. There are people in Westminster who are just dweebs. There are people in Westminster who are just really enthusiastic about something. Try and seek out the people who are also into that thing and kind of find your group, and don't feel the sense that you're not allowed to be there, because you kind of are. You are a citizen, and you're a human being as well. So another tip from Adam says, be a pest. When you're starting out in journalism, you should strive to be a bit annoying. Let's say you're starting out as a new reporter in a local newspaper. You should email every MP on your beat and make an effort to introduce yourself and continue to email them until you get a coffee or a phone call at least with them. If you're going to a press conference, just make an effort to find the press officer. They're usually the person lurking in the darkest corner of the room, usually looking more tired than even we journalists are, more stressed, and just introduce yourselves. If you can grab a word with the person delivering the press conference, even better. I mean, public events, you guys are involved in the world of events and people talking in depth about public policy. You, in a sense, you do have access to people who are kind of story-worthy and are really interesting political decision makers. So you'd be surprised how many people are just up for a chat. And you don't have to say, I'm trying to turn you over for a story and I'm here to do journalism. You just have a conversation with them, and you never know when that might be useful down the line. The more you do it, the more confident you'll become in those settings. So that sounds like really kind of cliched advice, but it is just true. When I first started journalism, I was terrified of picking up the phone, even just to ring a press officer for a boilerplate quote from the National Audit Office. It's just like, oh, it's a phone call and they're grown-ups. And then you just do it 7 or 8 times, and it's just part of your day. It's part of your job. So the things that scare you at the start of journalism, they will scare you, and you'll have to go through it. But it does get easier, and it does get better, and it's a lot of fun as well. So enthusiasm, the ability to get stuck into the detail, preferably the detail that no one else is getting stuck into, an ability to accept that you're sometimes just going to be wrong, and a willingness to gossip or just dork out with fellow dorks. They are really important things to me, I think, in reporters, in whatever kind of journalism you go into, whatever format, whether it's video, whether it's podcast, radio, print, then you will still, I think, need those skills. They are, to me, the kind of core of what makes a good political journalist. Now, I don't want this to just be kind of pie in the sky stuff. I want to talk about some of the practical questions as well, and the things that if you guys are just starting out, you might want to consider. I would say there is no fixed route into journalism. It's increasingly bad at social mobility. That's partly to do with the decline of local papers, which used to be a route out of places and a route up for people, and they are in a bad state. But it's not completely hopeless, and I'll talk to you about kind of some of the alternatives to local papers in a bit. Qualifications. So these do matter still. I did, as Amber explained, a master's at City University. It's a really good journalism school. It was expensive. I'm still essentially paying for that experience now, although I'm employed in journalism, which was a good outcome. And I wouldn't presume everyone else wants to be in that situation or can be. A cheaper alternative sometimes, but in my view, potentially actually better, because it often allows you to work at the same time, is an NCTJ qualification, which is really practically grounded, gives you a solid training in understanding how local and national politics work from the perspective of a reporter looking for stories. Excuse me. Gives you media law training, which is really, really important. It stops you libeling people, which is bad. That would be my one tip: don't libel people. And it will give you often really practical, very marketable skills. Things like shorthand. As we could start a whole 2-year-long Twitter thread about whether shorthand is useful. I don't have it, but I know lots of journalists find it very, very useful. And if you can get it, you should get it. Video editing is useful. Podcast production is useful. Some of these things you can teach yourself, but having it on paper to say, look, I've been taught these and I professionally know how to do it is a big thing. So it's not in everybody's means, this. And it can seem a bit hopeless when you don't have those qualifications. And I do know that feeling. I would say 2 of the best journalists I've worked with, and I won't name names to kind of embarrass them, but have no formal journalism qualifications. But they do have, in my mind, all of the things that I mentioned above. It undoubtedly will get you a foot in the door to have the qualifications, and I think this is on us as an industry, if you've got that raw talent, we should be helping to sort of train and support and get you in the door and recognise that. So I'm happy to share some books with you guys if that's worth doing. Don't worry, there's not anything I've written, but these are things that I found practically really useful starting out. A couple of books that are kind of on the NCTJ course, and one from the Centre for Investigative Journalism that will just get you thinking about these things. And actually you'll probably learn a lot of stuff just from reading them, and you can think, maybe this isn't for me, actually, this seems a little bit dry. Or you might think, yeah, I want to give this a go, and then you'll just ace your NCTJ exam because you've already done a little bit of the work. So I'll send a few links around, maybe if we can do that at some point. Work experience is another thing. I'm conscious I've rambled on for about 7 years, but work experience is another thing. Again, this is easier to get if your parents are cabinet ministers, but it's not impossible to get if they're not. And it is invaluable if you can make it work. You'd be surprised how many people in newsrooms with the right kind of email and pitch will actually have you in for a bit. If you are on work experience, be prepared to do quite mundane stuff, because no decent newsroom should be asking you to do their jobs for them for free. And if they do ask you to do that, you should refuse to do it because it's against the law. But you can get an insight into what the different roles are. Some of the research that helps improve stories, some of the kind of newsroom culture, which is largely swearing and drinking coffee. And it's a good in, but don't be downhearted if you get a foot in the door with work experience and it doesn't see you getting a front page scoop or even getting to do much writing. It will still look really good on your CV that you've been there and you've been in an environment like that. You will get a reference which will make editors pay attention. And again, there are practical barriers to doing this. There is a great organisation called PressPad, which helps people with placements find cheap places to stay, usually in London, because that's where often these opportunities are. That's not a perfect solution, but it shows that there are people thinking about how we can fix some of these problems, because we'll end up getting the same kind of people in, and that's bad for us as an industry and bad for you guys. A few tips for kind of approaching editors about work experience. Don't just email talking about what you did at uni, as fascinating as that might be, or the society you were involved in. That can be part of it, but talk about what you like about the specific title. Talk about a recent story of yours, of yours or of theirs that you liked, and kind of explain as a human being why you're interested in journalism and want to go into it yourself. It's important. People will say it's important to have a kind of personal brand, and I hate that concept, but being on social media unfortunately is quite useful. Having your own blog, having your own kind of video channel is is a useful portfolio. And fortunately, the means to begin these things the barriers to entry are much lower than they ever were. So you can just put your work up if you're happy with it and you're proud of it, and you can show that to people, and you can have a go at editing other people's work and show that that's something that you are interested in. So get your stuff together in one place and think about the way you want to present yourself to a newsroom and the thing you might be able to offer them that they don't already have. In terms of freelance pitching, this is another thing you can just begin doing without being employed already by a news organisation. Don't just kind of say you want to write about Tory cuts. Talk about which ones. Have they been covered before? Is it something new? What can you specifically bring to it? Who in an ideal world would you talk to about it? And even if you specifically can't yet approach that person, if the pitch is accepted and you're associated with that organisation, you probably will get the chance to if they're a big enough organisation. So kind of aim high in a pitch, and don't overpromise and underdeliver, but be ambitious and show enthusiasm for the idea that you've come up with. A fully formed pitch makes it a lot easier to kind of get yourself over the line. There's a few websites I'll send around as well that just are really useful. There's a weekly freelance opportunities newsletter that a few people I know sign up to and swear by. Again, difficult at the moment, but not impossible. Obviously, journalism.co.uk, hold the front page, often have entry-level journalism jobs. So places that are looking for kind of entry-level guys often will also be more keen for kind of work experience people to come in as well. So a final plea really on, I talked about the kind of decline of local newspapers and what a shame that is, I think, for a way into national reporting. I would say don't turn your nose up at trade magazines, trade titles. So these are titles that can sound really boring, like, not to knock anybody, but Serial Weekly or, Matchsticks Today. It's things that sound really obscure and really niche, but you can probably tell I've got this thing about being quite niche. And often trade mags require really good reporting. They require you to really, really know a beat inside out and to map out the contacts, because you're the one person in the world, maybe, or in a team of 4 or 5 who is covering and cares about this thing. And actually, you can get many of the kind of raw skills you need to be a good journalist from a trade title. If you're at a really good trade title, you might want to stay there forever, because places like Health Service Journal or Inside Housing are brilliant. They are just doing brilliant journalism by anybody's measure. And it might not be, I want to be at The Guardian, or I want to be at, I don't know how many Fabians want to be at The Telegraph, but maybe some do. But it's, doing good quality journalism at a title like that, to me, is more valuable than being at a national title and kind of grouting out clickbait. And you might find that is something you may have written off, you may be slightly apprehensive about, but I would kind of urge you to think about the kind of newsroom culture it's likely to be, and think about how you could really show off what you do in a place like that. So, it's journalism about and for the people running organisations, and you can't kind of kid a specialist audience. They really know this stuff inside out. So you have to be a good reporter to report for them. And it can make you a much better journalist to do that. And these jobs often are a bit easier to get into. There's less demand because people sort of turn their nose up at them, but they can be a really good proving ground. And often they are based outside of London. So if you're looking for something that perhaps fills a bit of that void that local journalism would have played, trade mags are, to me, kind of the way to go. I've got another inspirational quote here from my friend and former colleague, Natasha Clark. Natasha's at The Sun now. She used to work at PoliticsHome and City AM, and then went on to great things and left us all behind. But she wrote a really good piece a few years back, and she said her number one tip for political journalists is to remember who you're writing for. So, like all other types of journalism, the readers of politics stories are the most important asset. To be a good reporter means always putting them first. So no matter what organisation you end up at, don't forget who you are writing for. You're not just writing always to satisfy your own interests or because someone thinks you should. You're writing what the people reading it need to know. you can absolutely do that at a trade title as well. You have a very clearly defined audience and a set of people that you need to be an expert for and on behalf of, and that can get you really far in journalism. One final note before I shut up and start answering some of the questions that have come in is on imposter syndrome. So you will feel this every day if you're a good journalist. You will doubt yourself. You will feel only as good as your last story, unless you are just kind of born confident, in which case, congratulations. You'll feel like you're kind of the only person in political journalism who is not making it up as they go along. But actually, everyone is. We all are every day. Some people just have kind of different ways of showing it and channeling that energy. You are, as a journalist, dealing with the rough first draft of a really complex and increasingly complex and strange world. You're dealing with things you don't yet understand, combing through documents you don't understand, speaking to people 20, 30 years older than you who are experts, veteran MPs, people who will baffle you with their kind of analysis and knowledge. And all of that is intimidating. But all of you are completely entitled to be a journalist, to give political journalism a go if you take it seriously. It is a tough time in journalism, but there is a really vital need for people who know why it matters, and for people who are willing to kind of put in the hours and fight against those kind of forces of inertia and people who want you to cut every corner. But there's also kind of no use us as editors just wishing these things to happen. We have a duty, as I kind of touched on before, to make it easier for the best budding journalists to kind of be heard and to cast the net wider and not just kind of recruit in our own image. The more people we bring on board with more experiences and more knowledge that's beyond our own, then the better. But we also need to meet that with proper training and structure and support. We need to pay people properly, and we need to kind of meet you guys halfway. So I'm going to end with a really cheesy thing, but I genuinely do believe that the next generation of political reporters will be loads better than this one, and that there will be things you guys, story ideas you're thinking of now, ways of telling stories you're thinking of now that I would never think of, that my team might not think of. And the more people try this, the more people care about it, and the more people want to do it, the better journalism will be. And that is kind of where the future lies for us. So keep trying, and if there's any way I can help, then let me know. But I'll hand over now to a bunch of questions. I've managed to not get the Q&A tab working, Amber, because I'm really competent, but I don't know if you can fire them at me and I'll do my best. So I haven't seen any of these in advance.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. That was really, really interesting to listen to. Just a reminder for people who have joined a little bit late, you can watch us back after we're finished on Facebook Live, just in case you've missed anything. So the first question is from Perry Hewitt. As a working class graduate with financial support, I needed to get a job after uni. Unpaid internships in London were never an option. Thus, despite trying, I found it impossible to progress in journalism. Is this changing for the better? And do you think that following the pandemic, could major media companies see the benefit in remote interns?
I would hope so. I think all news organisations now have learned that they can do the majority of this stuff remotely. It is frankly to me insane that people have to move to London to work in newsrooms, and then we wonder why we're not covering things very well outside of London. Partly that's the end of local, the difficulties local newsrooms are facing. But if we can all do this from our living rooms, there's no reason why that can't be the case. There's no setup cost for a media organisation to do that, apart from training and supporting and checking in with you. I mean, I kind of be honest, I think the way these things always go, it might get worse before it gets better. People kind of close ranks in a time, and we're seeing newsrooms lay people off. But I mean, I would like to say to you that out of this crisis, we'll look at ways to reach out to people who we've realised they can do it and they can be trusted, and they don't have to be living in central London and spending 900 quid a month on rent and 80 quid on a sandwich, that if, you know, we will just lose people with different experiences if we don't adapt to that, and it will be to our detriment if we don't. So yeah, I don't want to give you some homily, but I you know, I some of us do care, and we'll try.
The next question is from Victoria Parrott. Are all political journalists full-time? And if not, what jobs do people tend to do alongside journalism?
Oh, that's a really good one. So not all journalists, political journalists I know are full-time. We've got someone on part-time in our newsroom by choice. And you can do other things around it. It can be difficult sometimes if what you do outside of your day job in journalism kind of conflicts with that. So if, for example, you were lobbyist for Big Biscuit and then you had to write about regulation of the sugar industry or something, it's a tricky one. But I mean, I sort of am of the view that it is better to have a job and work on journalism that you're proud of and you're happy with, and keep going with that and do the training like around that, rather than try and jump always straight into a full-time journalism job. If you're going to be in a full-time journalism job and hate it and find it overwhelming and find it's not a great newsroom, don't do it. If you can do the journalism you're proud of around work that might just kind of pay the bills, I would say that might be the way. That might be the way to go. But there are opportunities. I think the industry is getting better at flexible working. It's getting better at part-time working. I think the culture of being in a newsroom, 6 a.m. till 8 p.m, people realise that's pointless, and you don't actually become a better reporter that way. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying about trade mags and stuff, that if you find an organisation that actually values doing journalism well, they'll fit that around, that they'll make it as flexible as it needs to be around your life. If they just want churn and content and high volume of stuff, then it might not even be worth doing anyway. So yeah, sorry, I feel like that was really miserable and I didn't mean it to be at all. I think we're getting better at this stuff.
The third question is from Lewis Powell. How often do you give up on a story because you realise that the story isn't interesting or it seems too challenging?
I didn't quite catch the last bit of that, Amber. If it seems to be...
How often do you give up on a story because you realise that the story isn't interesting or it seems too challenging?
Quite a bit. I mean, most journalist inboxes are flooded with press releases and PRs and people saying this might be an idea. And a lot of the day, people calling you up, people WhatsApping you and saying, hey, this is an interesting thing. And actually part of your job as a journalist is to go, well, it's like interesting to you, but it's possibly not interesting to our readers and our audience. And sometimes there'll be stories that maybe you think actually personally are great, but just do not fit the audience that you're writing for, and that can be the kind of hardest part of it. I think sometimes you will give up on a story because you can't stand it up, because you just do not quite have enough material to do it well, and that can be frustrating too. Sometimes you can put stuff like that on the back burner and come back to it, and you can, like I was saying, write a few questions down and think, okay, what are the next few bits I could try and do to get this over the line. It's always worth doing that than just rushing it and throwing it out into the world unfinished, because it will get shot to pieces and you'll just feel terrible and you'll feel embarrassed. So there will be times when either you or your editor says, no, this isn't one for us and this doesn't work. And that's part of the job, getting used to that bit of rejection. But you can do things to kind of bulletproof your stories and do a bit of work before you even pitch it and suggest it. And hopefully then you'll kind of get it over the line and get it through. Or think about re-nosing it to a way that works for your audience. So it might be the initial core of the story, the way you approached it wasn't quite right for your audience, but you might be able to talk to 2 or 3 other people who can give you a quote or comment that makes it much more viable. So I often sneak things. Well, I mean, now I'm kind of acting editor. I do what I want, but that's not true. But I often would sneak things in through just getting an MP to comment on a thing. So you'll spot an injustice or a problem in a department, and it might be really quite dry. But actually, if you can get 3 or 4 MPs to be really cross about it, and you go to them and say, this thing seems off, and then they send you a great quote, you've suddenly got a lot more drama and a lot more suspense and dynamism to a story. And it's still the same core story, but you found a way to tell it that can be more kind of punchy and more interesting. So don't always just give up on a story. Think about 3 or 4 ways you could try and make it more interesting and sing a bit better. And a good editor will help you do that as well. But you will sometimes have to just junk them and move on, and that's kind of life.
The 4th question is from Sophie Connor. So I know that you've already briefly touched upon this, but how easy is it to get a job in journalism outside of London?
So I moved to London to get a job in journalism, so I won't pretend that I've got massive experience on this. I know it is difficult. I've thought about moving away before and found it's difficult to get jobs outside of the capital. Again, I hope the pandemic changes that. If there's one good thing that comes out of it for the industry, that we realise the proximity doesn't need to be as important. And newsrooms for a long time have been international and had people all around the world, and we've found that's okay. But actually, somebody living in Leeds, like no way can they work in a London newsroom as well, which is just mad. So slight digression there. It's difficult because local papers are in trouble. There are more trade titles based outside of the capital, and I would keep going on about this nerdy point, but it's a good way to go. And a good employer should discuss with you flexibility in remote working. I appreciate that's a difficult thing right at the start of your career and a difficult conversation to have. But don't give up just because you don't live in London, because then the problem won't ever be fixed.
The 5th question is from Ingrid Allen. If you've previously worked in a completely different, and in her case, very niche area of journalism, what's the best way to make the transition? Do you mind? Can I ask what the niche area is? Is that okay? That might be quite logistically complicated to do, but no worries. We can. In fact, let me see if I can. Just wanted to make this more complicated. So I will launch into a general ramble. Okay. Ingrid used to work for Practical Fish Keeping magazine. There you go. So absolutely everything that happens, almost everything that happens in the world, in the country, is touched on by politics in some way. And Practical Fish Keeping, you probably became an absolute expert in that subject. Every day in politics, in political journalism, and this will probably be if there's any people on this call who are sort of MP researchers or in that line of work, that every day throws something different at you. You have to suddenly learn about something new. You have to suddenly become a bit of an expert, or at least a good bluffer on some area of public policy you had no knowledge of or interest in before. So 5G networks. I mean, I never studied 5G networks, but I've had to try and understand the difference between core and non-core parts. Brexit has been 4 years of being forced to learn about really niche things, and that being a really useful skill. So I would not say that your time doing something that feels quite niche is a waste of time. It shows that you can get across the detail, that you can, hopefully on a beat like that, you've turned out stories that like nobody else has ever turned out, and you've spoken to people nobody else would have spoken to, and you've made that copy sing, and you've made that copy interesting. So that's an asset as far as I'm concerned.
then I don't think a good news editor would. I think we would look at the mechanics of the journalism you've done. We'd look at the quality of the journalism, and that should shine through regardless of the subject matter. So in terms of making the kind of transition to politics, that would be the kind of, to political journalism, that would be the kind of thing I would say, that you've shown you can get your head around complex stuff and make interesting copy out of it. And that's kind of what we have to do every day anyway. So yeah, all for Practical 50 magazine. I should have listed it with Serial today, but I have to say I was 2 years at Civil Service World, which is an amazing title, but sounds like, just like, well, what is that? But it's like fascinating. It's Whitehall, it's government, it's kind of the way the country is run, but the practical side of it. So I'm all about that stuff. It's great.
A follow-up question. If you're ever lucky enough to interview someone important, how do you get around the fact that they're often schooled in not giving direct answers?
Oh, that's a good one. That is a really good one. It comes with practice. So you get schooled at trying to get around their not very good answers. But it's really tricky because most politicians are media trained, and their job, unless they've got something they want to announce, is to go into an interview and deliver 0 news lines. And I would say there are people in the current cabinet who, I'm not going to name names, but who are very good at that at the moment. And you just kind of know that the interview is not going to deliver much in the way of news. But do your homework, be a dweeb, learn about the thing you're going to talk about. Don't bluff your way through it. Ministers can be good at the sound bites, but often they might not be across the detail. It might be the officials who are across the detail. If they've had a bad briefing that day, you can find a kind of gap in the armour there. So do your research, do your homework. And this you've just listened to me for 40 minutes make not a single concise point, but keep your questions concise, keep your questions focused and targeted, one line, and this is the thing you want to know. And don't be afraid to ask a stupid question, an obvious question that they've never had to actually answer before, that they've never had to give a straight answer to. Sometimes you can get too obsessed with tripping them up on a really niche thing, which can be great too, but sometimes they just haven't been asked about this specific thing. And when somebody puts it crisply and cleanly, you can get a bit of a shocked reaction. So we live in a world of media trained politicians who are keen not to commit news, but there's always a way. There is always a way. And if not, you can probably force a news line out of it anyway and say, this is a bigger deal than it was. Not that I've ever done
that. As a student, is writing in university newspapers useful as experience for entering into political journalism in the future? Is it relevant?
Yeah, 100%. I would say it depends what you want to go into. So again, if you want to be a columnist, just write great columns, write opinion pieces, have debates with people, do that straight away anyway at a university paper. But if you're going to go down the reporting side of things, I'm not looking for a student journalist to tell me what's going on necessarily in Westminster, but I might be really interested in a student journalist who has uncovered some financial malpractice in their university, or has just covered the drama of like a student union election in depth and got inside each campaign and talked to everybody around the kind of the candidates. So try and keep it local, try and keep it focused on things that you can bring authority and expertise to. And even though they might seem like, oh, that's not going to impress an editor, well, actually it will, because you'll have shown that you can get inside a story and that you can make something sing. So that would be my advice to you. Student papers are really useful. They are the opportunity in front of you, and you should do it. I didn't make the most of my student newspaper at all, and I do regret that, because when I went for my interview at City University, I had nothing to talk about other than just to blather on. And I actually screwed up my first interview, and I was offered a second interview because he felt sorry for me. But he made me do a portfolio of journalism. I had to do 6 or 7 articles that other people didn't have to do because they'd come at it with a portfolio already. And I thought, I'll just waltz into this, be fine. So don't do that. So get a portfolio behind you, do it in student journalism when you've got the chance. If you can't do it in student journalism, do it yourself. I don't want to say blog because you guys aren't 507 like I am, but write and do, you know, like write pieces for young Fabians, like just get writing, get used to writing, get used to promoting and pushing the stuff that you do. So yeah, absolutely, just take all the opportunities that come your way to write and put pen to paper. And some of it you'll look back on and cringe and go, oh, that was terrible. I'm so embarrassed by what I wrote when I was 18 or 19. Perhaps if you're a prime minister, you'll be constantly embarrassed by things you wrote in your early career. But it's fine. Everybody writes things that they think are rubbish later, and I probably think stories I wrote a year ago are terrible now. Just get writing and do it, and write what you know.
Kathleen Clark wants to ask, as an editor, do you have a good work-life balance? And if so, do you have any tips for newbies?
Tips for newbies on a good work-life balance. I have a terrible work-life balance. Partly that's my own fault in that I just get really into it. And that is one of the occupational hazards of political journalism, is that you just love it. And you're like, I want to do this story. Like, oh my God, person has resigned at 11 p.m. Got to write it now. And actually, sometimes you can step back and go, well, what am I adding to this by filing the same thing everybody else is filing? I think burning out in journalism can be a big problem. You need to look after yourself. You need to not put too much expectation on your own shoulders. You should be part of a team that is set up to share the kind of burden and share the responsibility. And you should be able to say, and these are conversations the same in every job, you should be able to say, look, this is really tough at the minute and I need to step back a bit. So be honest about how you're feeling, be honest about how hard the workload is. And one thing I would say, and this is another tip I got from a former editor I worked for, is uninstall Twitter on Saturday. So you got all the political shows on Sunday. Everybody who's lame is tweeting about Andrew Marr and Sophie Ridge on Sunday, like we all are. And there's basically, Twitter is divided into people who are smugly enjoying brunch, and then the rest of us who are like, oh my God, can't believe Lisa Nandy said that, #Marr. So Sunday will always be a horrific day, and you just have to accept that. But Saturday, no one does anything, apart from when the press conferences haven't done a global pandemic. Saturday is just a day of not much political news. Things are calm. Put your phone in the bin. Don't look at Twitter. Don't even talk to people about politics or political journalism. Go outside, have a walk, read a book, read some fiction, just be a human being, and jealously guard that day. And don't reply to people if they annoy you. Safeguard the time that is important to you, set your own limits, have honest conversations with the people you work with and for about how you're feeling, and you can manage that work-life balance. It's tough and it's an intense job, but like I say, it's better than a real job, so you'll enjoy it too, I hope.
The next question is from Milad Shazad. I know you covered this briefly before, but at what point did you decide that you wanted to pursue a career in political journalism?
Quite late on, really. So I vaguely wanted to be a journalist when I was younger because I liked writing. And I was like, well, I'm going to be a children's author because I'm a child. That was what I was into, reading children's books. And then that kind of evolved into, I'm going to write about music because I'm a teenager. And then I got a bit older and I got into politics at university. And I was like, actually, the thing that I actually get quite into is political coverage. And so I decided probably the kind of final year of university that this is what I wanted to do, undergraduate university, this is what I wanted to do quite seriously. And I think it kind of had to be political journalism for me for some reason. I didn't land, my first few jobs weren't in political journalism at all. But I think I thought that was the thing I was most interested in and wanted to cover. It took a while, but I think I always wanted to be a journalist. I always liked, I just liked the news. That sounds really sad, but I'm into it. I just like reading the news and talking about it and covering stuff and, like I say, annoying people. So it seemed like a good fit. It seemed like in the middle of a global recession, now is the time to go into a struggling industry. That was the thought process for me.
Chloe Timperley has asked,
Hi,
how
Chloe.
accommodating can newsrooms editors today be to disabilities that affect the speed at which you are able to produce work? And is there space in the industry for those who produce a lower volume of work, but where that work is high quality? Or is it only for people who can think and produce work very quickly?
That is a really, really interesting question, and to my infinite shame, it's not one I've thought about. I would say it depends on the newsroom culture you're in. Some newsrooms are just all about speed and churn and get stuff up quickly, and that's especially the case in online journalism. I think that's less so, a little less so in print, certainly less so in magazines, but it's also less so in kind of long form online journalism as well. Places that are not just churning out stuff on the news cycle are looking at more reflective, analytical pieces. I mean, I don't feel like you should be limited at all in what you're able to do. That the industry should limit you in any way in what you're able to do. So I mean, I don't have a massively great answer to that. It's something that I should think about more. But I would say there are forms of journalism out there that aren't all about just churning it out, where you're going to get a bollocking for not being the fastest, not being, because you should have a whole series of other skills and perspectives that make you a great journalist too. So I think it's another area where we have to do better as well. So thanks for that's a really good question. Thanks.
That is all of the questions, unless anybody else has any questions that they want to ask.
Yes, you can contact me if you need to. What I can say at the minute is that, so unfortunately we don't give work experience at the moment. We just don't. It's been a long-standing company policy, but I am more than happy to look at any writing and give you guys advice and take a bit of time out to talk you through what works and what doesn't. People did that for me, and it was really helpful. And I won't sort of promise you guys, oh yeah, there's a job or I'm going to be your way into the industry, but I can definitely try and give you some feedback and support and guidance. And like I say, that list of books that I sort of mentioned and websites, I'm happy to, in whatever format, kind of get those out to you guys as well, because I think they would be helpful. Usually the best way to get hold of me is Twitter, because despite saying don't be on it all the time, I'm on it all the time, and I'll get a DM on that, or just email me. It's Matt LP Foster at protonmail.com. So yeah, drop me an email, and I'm always happy to give some feedback or support or guidance.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time out to do this event. We really, really appreciate it. And I've certainly learned a lot more about the political journalism industry. So thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you guys for being enthusiastic and excited enough about this stuff. It's kind of reminded me why I do this and why I find it interesting as well. So thanks so much. And thanks for your great questions. I mean, you're halfway there if you're asking questions like that. All right. Well,